Welcome to the New Mormon Truth, video number 13, History of the Mormon Temple Ceremony, Part 4. So this video is not an expose of the Mormon Temple Ceremony. And just to cover it briefly, Part 1, video 10, covered why Mormons build temples, what Mormons do in temples. Part 2 covered the development of the temple ceremony in Kirtland and Nauvoo, that's 1836 to 1850. And Part 3 covered video number 12 covered the changes post-Nauvoo to 2018, and I didn't know when I made this, I think in October, that the church was going to come and make some changes in January 2019, so I decided to make a part 4, which is going to cover the January 2019 changes. So please subscribe, and please hit like if you like the video. So just a summary, just in case you haven't watched the other parts. The 1846 ceremony, or temple ceremony, was a fully nude, or a nude full body washing and anointing in a tub, and that was, after that was an Adam and Eve drama that lasted about 8 hours. If you want complete information about this, go back and watch the other videos. And the 2018 ceremony ended up being a fully dressed, or the washing and anointing is a fully dressed dabbing of the forehead, and that's followed by an Adam and Eve drama that lasts about 1 hour and 40 minutes. Just a note, in 1950 the endowment was 4 hours. You can see this washing and anointing portion of the endowment has drastically changed, and the drama has dropped from 8 hours to just about 2 hours. In my last video I said it was about 2 hours, but it's about in 2018 is about 1 hour and 40 minutes. So, and if you watch video number 3, there were major temple ceremony changes in 1924, mainly as a result of the Reed Smoot hearings, which he was a polygamist, or an elected polygamist, and they had a bunch of hearings to see if they would seat him. Also 1955, due to the Swiss temple, basically the temples went to a single room endowment. And then in 1990 is generally attributed to the declining temple attendance. So major changes then. And this, most people, or maybe not most people, but there's a significant amount of people that have gone through in 1990 that are still ex-members or members. And then in January 2019, endowment changes which are significant were addressed, or were introduced, and most of these address gender equality. So then, about my only commentary about the gender equality is that I'm going to say this is a step in the right direction. I know there's a lot of ex-Mormons out there that any change, they're going to say, look, the church is changing stuff, bad church, but we should see this as a change in the right direction. Now, I'm fully aware and agree with the critics of the church out there that there won't be gender equality in the church until women are in leadership. I don't know if that requires priesthood ordination, or if the church will change to a point to where women are leading the church without the priesthood. And also there needs to be LGBT acceptance. So, in January 2019, the first president issued a statement regarding the temple. And we're going to read this paragraph by paragraph with commentary. And always, as I note out, all my references, which are listed at the end of the video, and you can click the link in the program description, or the video description. You can go look up all my sources and check them out. So that statement said, the first paragraph, this is a statement from the first presidency, said, "Whenever the Lord has had a people on the earth who will obey His word, they have been commanded to build temples. Scriptures document patterns of temple worship from the times of Adam and Eve, Moses, Solomon, Nephi, and others." So just critiquing this paragraph. There's no mention of temples in Genesis or the book of Moses where you'd find um, Adam and Eve in the additional Mormon or LDS scripture. The tabernacle of Moses and the temple of Solomon um, have are far different in layout and rituals than modern temples. I covered this in my second part 2 of my video about these tabernacle and temples of Solomon. You can go check out the layout and the rituals performed in there. So maybe my point with this one is that they're different. The the, the rituals mentioned in these two temples are different than are taking place in the LDS temples, and the layout is different in those temples. And Nephi did build a temple after the manner of the temple of Solomon, 2 Nephi 5:16, but nothing about the ritual that goes on in the temple except that they kept the law of Moses. So I'm just going to go back to this one. So I assume they built it after what was in the Bible, and the rituals were after the ones that were in the Bible. That's all the Book of Mormon says. It says nothing about these modern temples with the modern ceremonies. Second paragraph of the first presidency statement says, "With the restoration of the gospel in these latter days, temple worship has also been restored to bless the lives of people across the world on the other side of the veil." Now, if you have something that's restored, that means it was there in the first place and you restored it. Just like the restoration of the gospel, we would say the gospel was preached by Jesus and then lost. There's an apostasy and then restored. So this statement implies that something was there, lost, and then brought back. By temple worship, I'm going to focus on the endowment and not on the baptism for the dead or temple marriage. That's a whole nother discussion. So my question will be, so which version of the endowment is the restored version? Is it the 1846, the 1924, the 1990, the 2005? This is where you have a lot of the big change in the initiatory, or the 2019 version. If you're not too sure what I'm talking about, please go watch the other videos. So which one is the restored version if it's been restored? Now, just to point out that the LDS apologists state that the key elements have not changed. Usually the presentations I've seen, they're talking about the covenants. So what are unchanged key elements of the endowment? Is it the washing and anointing? No, there's been major changes. I've documented that in the videos. Is it the covenants? No, there's been changes. There was an oath of vengeance that was instituted, and that was changed to the oath of retribution, which was then eliminated. We've also seen changes in the oaths that women make to their husbands and things like that. So there's been changes to the covenants. So the LDS apologists say that where there's been changes to the covenants, there's been changes. Not major changes, but there's been changes. So if they say the LDS, if they say the temple endowment has not been changed because it's only the key elements, well, I hate to tell you, there's been changes. Is it the drama, the Adam and Eve drama? No, major changes. We know this. It's gone from like 8 hours down to 2 hours. There's obviously been major changes. Is it the keyword signs and tokens? These haven't been changed. So these are the only things that have changed. So maybe this is the endowment, is the keyword signs and tokens, which makes you wonder that if this is the key element of the endowment, then why do we go watch, why are people repeatedly going and watching a almost 2-hour presentation of the endowment? You know, if you think about baptisms for the dead, you don't go to an hour-long baptismal meeting and then do a baptism for the dead. You just go in there and do the baptism for the dead. So If this is the only important part, why are people just going there and doing the main part that you need to learn? Be a good question. So, to me, if someone's going to make the point of that this is the key part of the endowment, then sure. I don't know. If that's an assertion they make, then okay. Well, let's talk about it that way, but don't say the key part of the endowment of the Washington anointings, the covenants, of the dramas, because those have all changed. Continuing with the first presidency statement. Over these many centuries, details associated with temple work have been adjusted periodically. Now, there's been major changes, including language, methods of construction, communication, and record keeping. Now, I'm not too sure what they mean by communication. Maybe that's how the presentation format of movie and live action. I'm not too sure. Language, that's definitely been changed. The last statement is the one that I have problems with. Prophets, plural, have taught that there will be no end to such just adjustments as directed by the Lord to his servants. Well, I completely disagree with this statement. I like to have them produce a statement by at least two prophets that have taught this. In fact, I'm going to say it's the exact opposite, and here's my proof. I asked a couple, has the ordinance of the sacrament changed? The sacrament is an ordinance. Go look it up. If you're LDS, go to lds.org and type in sacrament ordinance, and you'll see that it's an ordinance. No, hasn't changed. The wording hasn't changed. The prayer and the basic, sacrament hasn't changed. I guess you could say they've substituted for the water and bread, or for the wine, the grape, to the water. Has the ordinance of the baptism changed? Nope. You're still baptized by immersion, and the prayer has not changed. So now let's quote Joseph Smith in 1840. He, God, set the ordinances to be the same forever and ever, and set Adam to watch over them, to reveal them from heaven to man, or to angels to reveal them. Ordinances to be the same forever and ever. Once again, Joseph Smith, 1843. Ordinances instituted in the heavens before the foundation of the world in the priesthood for the salvation of man are not to be altered or changed. Very clear. Now, of course, if you go to lds.org, they'll tell you that, well, a single statement by a person does not constitute doctrine. It's really the first presidency in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles that set the doctrine. So just to make sure that this is okay, meaning this, this was Joseph Smith speaking, and most people take his word as pretty much gospel. You start quoting Joseph Smith, I've never heard anybody in the church stand up and go, well, I disagree with that. He was wrong. He just said that once. Never heard anybody ever say that. So just to point out that even according to current LDS thinking, so was this a single utterance? One, Joseph Smith was a prophet. So this quote appears in the 2001 Ensign article. So that's an official publication by the church. And two, another prominent publication by the church in 2011 in the teachings of the presidents of the church, Joseph Smith. This quote also appears in there. So here you have the church, two separate official publications using this quote. So I assume, that this is a good quote to use. So now I ask them to please show me something where prophets, plural, have said that they're going to be changed, when we directly have Joseph Smith, the prophet Joseph Smith saying they're not to be changed, and the church using this quote twice. And then I know these quotes appear in my previous video, but just to drive the point home, here's a quote from Apostle Haight, and the Ensign 1979, once again official publication from an apostle. We explain briefly the apostasy and restoration, that there is a vast evidence in history of an apostasy from the doctrine taught by Jesus and his apostles, that the organization of the original church became corrupted, and sacred ordinances were changed to suit the convenience of men. So, so you go through all these changes in the past video, you have to say, were these changes really to suit the convenience of men? And here the church has said that when you have changes to the ordinances to suit the convenience of men, this was basically the apostasy. So now, I think the last paragraph of the first presidency quote, "A dedicated temple is the most holy place of any place of worship on the earth. Its ordinances are sacred, are not to be discussed outside the temple." So it's funny that we discuss the baptisms for the dead outside the temple. And we discuss sealings, temple marriages outside the temple. I mean, not the exact wordings of the sealings, and maybe we all sort of probably been to a baptism. So I'm sort of confused why we show pictures of fonts and sealing rooms and discuss these with sort of pretty open discussion. But when it comes to the endowment, nothing is said. So I'm confused when he says the ordinances. So basically, he's just referring to the endowment. But even the endowment has been discussed in detail. I covered this in the first video. That even from church sources, we learned that the endowment consists of a recital of the creation, the Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, and their disobedience and expulsion, etc., etc. See Part 1. We also learn from the church sources about the endowment contains covenants. I think there's 7 total covenants, and we find 4 right from church sources. So I'm confused if we're not to discuss them outside the temple. We find a lot of information from the church about the temple. And these covenants are, obeying God and keeping his commandments, living the gospel of Jesus Christ, keeping yourself morally pure and virtuous, and dedicating your time and talents to the Lord's service. Now, if you're offended by this is straight out of church sources, and you can go see Part 1. So, I'm confused. So now let's get to the changes. And like I said, most of the January 2019 changes were the focus on gender equality. So let's look at some gender equality changes from 1815 to 1904. Well, the first one's not really a gender equality, and maybe it's the reverse. So the husband in 1857, husbands started conducting their wives through the veil. So step in the wrong direction. And step in the wrong direction was also somewhere in the 1800s, between 1815 and 1904. We know women started veiling their faces when making covenants. I know that was a short slide because most of the other changes were in 1990. So the 1990 gender equality changes, not all the changes, these are just the ones that focus on gender equality. They removed the 5 points of fellowship. This is a very close embrace that was done through the veil. And no doubt I could see women, and this was always it isn't like they were embracing a female through the veil, but it was another guy they didn't know. Very close embrace, and I can see how this would trouble women. It even troubled me, it's like it's a very close embrace, and you do it to somebody. That was removed. Changed the women's covenant for obedience. Basically, in 1984, it said they would observe and keep the law of your husband and abide by his counsel in righteousness. That was changed in 1990 to observe and keep the law of the Lord and hearken unto the counsel of your husband as he hearkens unto the counsel of the Father. So basically, 1984 is basically obey your husband. And now 1990 it says, hey, obey the Lord and hearken unto your husband. This sounds like a softening, but in my last video I showed that hearken, this really means obey. I think they tried to soften the word or use a different word that sounded like a softening, but it was really the same thing. I didn't really see a change personally. This is still the same thing. And just so you know, the men covenant didn't change. They obey the law of God. Maybe it says the law of Elohim, I'm not too sure. And keep his, oh no, the law of God and keep his commandments. So why it was change, it's not a real change. They've removed faulting Eve for the fall. And they change references just to Adam and Eve. Not really that this is a gender equality thing, but the orders from Elohim were repeated fewer times to make the movie shorter. So those are the 1990 changes. I put those all in one slide. Oh, finally to the January 2019. I know it's been 20 minutes, but I got these from several internet sources. New Name Noah, the famous guy that videotapes the temple ceremonies, has not taped it or released it, or someone has not taped it and he hasn't released it, so I don't know. So, 3 different sources. I would probably put all these in one source and or I use 3 different sources. I could put them under one, but I decided just to show you that I was looking at different sources for this information since it hasn't been, like released in audio or video form. And you'll see that I have a couple comments where I'm thinking that 2 of the changes that people have cited are incorrect or have not changed. The changes are, 1, I think there's 12 or 11 or 12 that I'm going to go through. There's a new movie. There's a little live action. The previous movies were live action. Now it's mostly still pictures, even when there's Adam and Eve, with voiceover narration, and there's new music. So maybe you're sort of like watching a PowerPoint presentation with some music. Personally doesn't sound very exciting. And the endowment was shortened from an hour and 40 minutes to an hour and 20 minutes. Much of the repetitive return report was eliminated. Sort of going back to 1990, they eliminated some of this. If you don't know, this is very Masonic. I should actually do a couple of videos on the Masonic stuff, but if you're the Masonic things, the worshipful master, there'd just be this dialogue between the worshipful master, the senior deacon, and the junior deacon. And it was very much like you see in the temple where God would talk to Jehovah and Jehovah would talk to Michael, and then they would go back. And you see the same thing in opening of a Masonic lodge. So basically now this has all been eliminated. Temple robes are now only applied to the Melchizedek priesthood and are only donned or put on once. Temple robes used to be applied to the Aaronic priesthood, and they were put on, meaning sort of during the Aaronic, and then changed Melchizedek. So that's been done away with. Only the robes now only apply to Melchizedek, and the slippers are no longer considered part of the robes, and thus are not removed. I believe there's a part where you take them off and put them on. I can't really remember, but this was noted that the slippers were no longer considered part of the robe. So there's something to do with the temple robes and putting them on and taking them off, and the slippers. I should say these changes are not really gender equality changes. These are just sort of some general changes. 5, instead of that will do after covenants, they say thank you. And the law of the gospel is now referred to as the higher law. Now to the gender equality changes. Oh, God no longer speaks to just the man, but equally to both Adam and Eve. There's more speaking for Eve. In the previous movies, Eve hardly spoke, or didn't have or hardly spoke, or maybe had a few lines and up until a certain point, then speak again. So, but now there's more speaking for Eve, and Adam and Eve direct comments to the audience at the end of the movie, and Eve has the final word. So that's good, putting Eve more into the movie and with direct speaking parts to the participants. I don't know what is said. I'd be very interested. I'm very curious to see what Adam and Eve have to say at the end of the movie. Women are no longer required to veil their faces. If you want to hear more about that, I'd go watch one of the podcasts but no longer required to veil their faces. And probably one of the big ones that people talk about is the separate gender-based covenants for obedience for men and women is now a uniform covenant to obey God. Women previously, and I just went over this. Previously, women obeyed God and hearkened to their husband, and husbands obeyed God. But now they just both, obey God. Someone stated that the law of chastity is expressed with more gender equality. I don't know what this means. I'd like to see the text, because I went and looked up the 1990 version of the law of chastity, and it says, the daughters of Eve and the sons of Adam shall have no sexual relations except with their husbands or wives to whom they are legally and lawfully wedded. So I was looking for, some difference between Adam and Eve and their requirements. Maybe I'm reading this and not seeing it, but I don't see a difference, because it just says they're not to have sexual relations except with their husbands or wives. And the initiatory, basically, it now says they're anointed to be, or women are now anointed to be a queen and a priestess to the new and everlasting covenant. One source said was anointed as a queen and priestess in the new and everlasting covenant to rule and reign in the house of Israel with your husband. This last part in green I didn't find, and most sources are saying this, so I really don't know what the text is. The note, the 1984 and the 1990 text said queens and priestesses, or a queen and priestess to your husbands. So that the main comment is that they're saying, well, they've changed it now. It doesn't say your husband, but the new and everlasting covenant, the modern interpretation of it is that's your eternal marriage. So you're being queen and priestess to the marriage. There isn't really a true difference. Once again, I'm going to go back to my whole discussion about obeying your husband and hearkening to your husband. There wasn't a real difference to me. They changed the words and make it sound, oh, it's different, but I don't really see it being different. And if this is the text, to rule and reign in the house of Israel with your husband, yeah, this does not a real change. And because men are kings and priests to God, why are women, if you want equality, they should be anointed a queen and priestess to God, not to a marriage covenant. And then the other commentary I've heard is this still leaves the door open for polygamy, because the new and everlasting covenant, when it was revealed, was not just this monogamous temple sealing, but it was the new and everlasting covenant was polygamy. So this does mean polygamy when you read that section. So this is actually, if you go back to early Mormonism, this is saying polygamy. So they've sort of left polygamy there, or open to interpretation of polygamy, and then they haven't really changed the covenant, in my opinion. It needs to have equality. The women just need to say they're a queen and priestess to God. It's just that simple. It needs to be the same thing as the men. Also in the initiatory of the women, it's been reported only by one source that the anointing of the ear was changed from hear the word of the Lord and the counsel of your husband to just hear the word of the Lord, which saying, oh great, that's a great change, and that would be a great change if this was the original wording. This is the new wording, because it got rid of the gender bias. But I think this is incorrect because this phrase which this person is reporting in counsel of your husband, I did not find in the 1990 temple ceremony text. So all I could find was when they anointed the ear was hear the word of the Lord. So while this is a reported change, I don't think it is a change. And if this was, and if it was changed to this somewhere after 1990, then it's been changed back. So, which would be a good thing. Because basically, it says the same thing. The men's and the women's anointing says the same thing. They hear the word of the Lord. And that's it. Here are the sources. I'm just going to go through these quickly. You can hit pause or you can click on the link in the video notes.